Now just 4 months out from the 2020 presidential election, and there are already post-election trades being discussed. Here to break down some of the different election outcomes and how they could play out in the markets is Michael Zezas, U.S. public policy strategist at Morgan Stanley. Michael, good to see you. Let's sort of walk through. You have some pretty interesting trade ideas around the election, and the question, of course, is how to make the bet in advance. But let's just sort of walk through your top 3 ideas here.
Sure. Yeah, so I think this really boils down to what type of outcome could really be a meaningful change from the status quo. And when we break down the different election scenarios, the most obvious and meaningful and likely break from the status quo is one where the Democrats take the White House and control the Senate. And this is also the place where there's the most investor confusion. Right. So in the surveys that we've run with investors, this is the place where they're the most concerned because they're concerned about higher taxes and higher regulation. But we think it's also a place where the sort of reality of policymaking can be quite different than that. Right. So taxes are probably going to go up, but they're probably going to go up less than people think. And they're probably going to be accommodated by a major expansion in spending, probably on the healthcare side. So there are actually sectors we think can do quite well here, which are probably seem somewhat counterintuitive. For example, managed care organizations we think could do pretty well because I think the Democrats are probably going to be able to execute on a $1 trillion plus healthcare expansion plan, but not Medicare for all. So that means pumping more money through the existing kind of apparatus of managed care organizations, which do better on a margin basis. And we also think financials can do pretty well here as well, because you're creating kind of a demand-side stimulus in their key customer cohorts, but we don't think that there's going to be, or sort of the promise of regulatory rollback doesn't necessarily change much because the deliverance from the Republicans on regulatory rollback so far has been pretty far short of what would have actually benefited the sector.
Michael, what's your take on what it means for big tech, since big tech has effectively not just led the market, but to some degree held it up during this period?
Yeah, so listen, I think if you get, if the polls that we see right now continue up into the fall, it's hard to push back on the notion that that wouldn't weigh on investor sentiment in tech. But I think the post-election reality of a Democratic sweep is far murkier. So put it this way, the ability for either party to actually legislate some serious tech regulation is pretty minimal, not just because, one, there are other priorities that that voters want each party to deal with, but two, I don't think either party has really laid out its own sort of policy technology for dealing with the tech problem. They know what the problems are at a high level, privacy and size. They don't actually have a plan to deal with it. So I think the sort of fear is probably worse than the reality in that sector.
What about the world of energy, both traditional and what might describe as new energy, or electrification and solar and wind and stuff like that? Yeah, so I think this is something where you probably get in a Democratic sweep positive sentiment leading into the event. But the follow-through on that is probably going to be tied to whether or not the Democrats choose to prioritize infrastructure spending as opposed to healthcare spending. And this is a tough call because there are political benefits to both. We're arguing that we think they're going to skew towards healthcare. But if they decide to skew towards infrastructure, which in theory makes sense, we're still going to have kind of a somewhat weak economy. There's higher multipliers dealing with that. Getting infrastructure done and putting it through a progressive caucus probably requires kind of a green veneer. So a lot more money going towards clean energy, solar, et cetera. Those are types of things that could follow through. So I think modest favorite that healthcare goes first, but infrastructure certainly in the mix.